Welcome to today's 2-minute warning feature interview, where we take a deeper dive into the energy transition that's happening in the Middle East and beyond. My name is Tomas Valdez. I'm a senior associate at Gulf Intelligence, and I'm delighted to have Dr. Raad Alkadiri here with me today. Dr. Alkadiri is Managing Director of Energy, Climate, and Resources at Eurasia Group. Dr. Alkadiri, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
To kick it off, I'd like to say that over the last several years, we've seen the oil and gas sector somewhat accepting now the reality that climate change is a global challenge, that they have to be part of the conversation. They can't just ignore it, and also have to be part of the solution. This amid the fact that with COP27 happening right now in Egypt, oil companies were banned from attending the previous COP26 that happened in Glasgow last year. What are your thoughts on this? How are oil company attitudes and approaches evolving?
Look, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the fact that oil companies are now seeking to be part of the transition. They recognize there's pressure on them from their shareholders, there's pressure on them from the financial community to make changes in terms of their business, to contribute to the reduction of emissions and to contribute to the overall transition and the overall climate equation. And what we're seeing is companies adapting to that, and companies seeking to, in some cases, reinvent themselves in terms of that. I think you have really two broad buckets. You've got companies that are looking at technology and are seeking to use technology as a means of reducing the emissions of their operations to decarbonize hydrocarbons in some ways. So looking at scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and seeking to make themselves the cleanest producers and seeing that as an additional benefit on top of companies seeking to be the cheapest or the most efficient. So that's an added element to the equation. I think some of the other companies are moving, and European companies in particular, moving away from molecules to electrons. What they are seeking to do is go down the value chain to transform themselves into energy companies, into providers of a broad range of energy, including renewables. So the strategies are somewhat divergent, but the direction is clear. And it's a recognition that energy transitions are an issue that companies need to address. It's going to be important to their long-term survival, and their investors and their finances all want it as well.
And with this bifurcation in strategies that are nevertheless all headed in the same direction, today's energy market environment is one of volatility, where we see high oil prices, and that's partially being blamed on years of underinvestment in oil production as investors have started to divest and move towards clean energy. We're also seeing a change in major oil producers to decarbonize their operations along the value chain, like you mentioned. Do you think that these oil companies are changing their ways because of policy? Do you think, or to what extent rather, is their calculus also impacted by organic natural demand, market demand?
I think it's a combination of factors, Tomas. I don't think it's any one individual factor that you can point to. And the volatility in the short term is much a product of geopolitics as it is anything else. And the uncertainty that geopolitical events are bringing at this moment in time. The war in Ukraine is transforming the energy sector in many ways. The fallout in terms of the movement of flows, the availability of supplies, the politics of supplies are all changing. But I think it's fair to say that oil and gas companies also have a difficult road to traverse over the next few years. And they are caught between the demands of investors and caught between the demands of the financial sector and their own ability to respond to that. And what I'm trying to say is this: for oil companies where investments last 20, 25 years, the key is to have an element of certainty. Now, oil companies have always dealt in the world of risk. They make money in the world of risk. They are there to take risks, to find resources, sometimes in the most difficult parts of the world, and to produce them for the market. That's something that they're very used to. This is a different type of risk, though. Because this is a risk about whether demand is going to be there in the long term. This is a world that, in energy market terms, is transforming relatively quickly. What shareholders want, what the financial industry wants, what it is willing to reward is changing, and all companies are having to adapt accordingly. So you are seeing that underinvestment that you're mentioning. It's very clear in the numbers, particularly from private sector companies. That underinvestment is there. It's difficult to go to boards. It's difficult to go to shareholders and say, we need to make a large 25-year investment in upstream assets to develop those with no certainty as to what the demand picture is going to look like through the life of those assets. So I think that's going to weigh on the industry for some time to come. And it's going to create volatility, and it's going to create price swings as the industry adapts. And we're at the beginnings, really, of its change of course. So it's going to take time to get that change of course stabilized. And it's going to want, and investors are going to want, greater certainty about what the long-term future holds. And right now, that certainty absolutely is not there.
Great. And I'm just going to take a quick pause right now. I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Do you think you might be able to get up maybe a little bit closer to the mic? We want to make sure that we're able to capture everything you say.
Is that better?
Yes, that sounds better for me.
Okay.
Give me 1 second here. There we go. Great. Thank you. We'll start back up from here. And shifting to that role of geopolitics, where you mentioned that energy companies are across the board facing these pressures where they're being pulled in all kinds of different directions from regulators, from investors. Right now, this week, we have the US midterm elections happening where a lot of political fortunes are shaped by the rise and fall of energy prices. At the same time, the US recently released millions of barrels from its strategic reserves while pushing for a cap on the price of Russian oil. We have OPEC raising its oil demand forecast through 2030. India is using coal, and Europe is in some ways going back to it. How much do you think the realm of geopolitics is affecting not only the immediate short-term energy transition, but the long-term trajectory as well?
I think the role of geopolitics is outsized in the market at this moment in time. You rarely get events like a land war in Europe. And I think, the knock-on effects, particularly of an economy, the scale of Russia and the interlinked nature of the Russian economy with the global economy, is something that adds to the spillover effects and adds to the additional pressures on global markets more generally. That's what we're seeing playing out. This year is a unique year. Certainly it's an unusual year. I can't think of another year in the last 20 where you've had a geopolitical event of this scale and that is this seismic. And it's going to be something of a tipping point. It is, I think the phrase watershed is overused for various events geopolitically, but this is going to be one. And you're seeing it playing out in energy markets very clearly. The longer term ripple effects, some of which that you mentioned, it's doing sort of three very sort of big things to markets that they haven't seen before. One is this redirection of flows. It's certainly the case that you now have good and bad oil and gas. Russian oil and gas are considered bad geopolitically, and that has limited the number of markets that oil and gas can go to. And increasingly over time, what you're seeing is a readjustment of flows globally as a result. I think the second thing that you mentioned is that you are seeing this intervention by consumers in markets much more directly. And the fact that the US is using its SPR almost as swing production, that consumers are beginning to challenge OPEC's role in terms of market management. We're not there yet, but certainly their intervention has been much more direct and much more short term. And again, that's not something that we've seen in the past. And also, it starts to complicate this energy transitions process. A process that really does require international cooperation is made more difficult as the spillover of sanctions and the spillover of redirection of flows take place. Energy security is now the priority across the world. We have lost a lot of Russian gas. We have had disruptions to Russian oil, and all of that is feeding through. And I think what that's doing from an energy transitions perspective is one, creating greater uncertainty, but is also driving different parts of the world to pace their energy transitions differently. In Europe, what we're seeing is an acceleration. Energy transitions is now synonymous with energy security. It's reducing emissions is seen as a way of enhancing energy security by bringing renewables in. In the US, in China, in India, other parts of the world, that's not necessarily the same thing. And so what you are seeing is, again, divisions between regions or differences between regions as they seek to pursue energy transition and energy security goals, and tension that emerges from that, and particularly between the industrialized world and emerging markets. As Europe sucks in LNG and creates new demand for LNG, it's pricing out smaller and poorer emerging markets. So I think all of those factors are going to come together to make the world of energy over the next decade a little more unstable, certainly more uncertain, and at the same time introducing new dynamics that we either haven't seen before or where the relative importance of some of those dynamics change.
So geopolitics is certainly having a short-term impact on the energy sector, where now there's increased nuance, like you said, where it's not just, conventional fossil fuels are bad, but now there's bad oil and good oil depending on how geopolitics come into play. And by extension, geopolitics, like you mentioned, also have an impact on capital flows. For example, recent OPEC production cuts have incentivized asset managers and investment funds around the world to start to move back into oil. Do you think that this recent redirection of capital is maybe a blip in the timeline, or does it have the potential to reallocate capital towards oil and away from renewables in the medium and long term?
I think money is always going to chase profit. And what we're seeing in the short term is, the money markets really looking to see where they can get the greatest return. And with oil prices at their current levels, obviously that is a point of, that is a sector that delivers returns and is going to deliver profits. I think a lot of it is going to depend in the longer term on, government policy, and a lot of it is going to depend on how the financial sector itself starts to look at issues to do with climate, to do with disclosure, and to do with balancing portfolios to meet demands of their own shareholders, demands of their own investors for greater diversification and more focus on climate change and climate issues. So I think what we're going to see is certainly some money coming back into oil in the short term. Whether that goes into long-term investment is a bigger question. There's a difference right now between making money out of volatile markets and high oil prices and investing in the long term when the demand picture is uncertain. So I don't think it's going to necessarily show up in significantly higher capital investment. It will probably also, by dint of government policy and by dint of incentives, also start to move into renewables more. Remember, the solution to the present energy crunch doesn't just lie in oil and gas. It lies in balancing that oil and gas production, and balancing investment in oil and gas with balancing investment in renewables, which are increasingly coming into the money and which are increasingly seen as being vital to the energy transition. So I think what you will have is, again, a period of volatility, a period of uncertainty, but investment continuing to go into different types of energy. In the longer term, oil and gas will probably suffer, at least until the equation or the debate ceases to be as binary as it is right now. One of the lessons of the last year is that actually investment in oil and gas and the production of oil and gas is going to be important in terms of dampening out the disruptions of energy transition. And more importantly, there's a willingness by oil and gas companies to invest in technology and to invest their capital in ways of making their product cleaner. That would seem to point towards a debate that should be not binary, but rather include all of the above. I don't think we're there yet. One of the outcomes, again, of this present energy crunch is it may give a greater realization as to the importance of oil and gas in actually managing energy transitions, as opposed to how oil and gas is seen, which is somehow being a blockage to energy transition.
And with energy transition, changing gears and focusing on the big event happening this month, COP27 in Egypt. A few years ago, we had COP21, also known as the Paris Agreement, which at the time was seen as a landmark event. Meanwhile, since then, a lot of new promises and commitments have been made, especially at last year's COP26 in Glasgow. Today, the developing world is still facing huge funding problems, and energy access is still a major issue across the board, not only in Europe, but also for many countries in the developing world and Africa, which is hosting this year's COP. How would you say the developing world is viewing this transition and this ongoing dialogue amid the COP backdrop in Egypt? And what's their stance right now in terms of the energy transition?
I think for the developing world, I mean, the issues are different clearly from the industrialized world. The industrialized world are focused on reducing emissions, trying to sort of look ahead and implement emissions reduction, climate mitigation across the board. For the developing world, in a lot of parts of the world, they're at the context. They're facing the impacts of extreme climate events around the world. And for them, the priorities are somewhat different. One is to actually deal with climate adaptation and critically the funding for climate adaptation as they face the consequences of the industrialized world having used up as much of the carbon budget as we actually have. And I also think, there was a question for them about energy transitions and the emphasis on climate mitigation, not undermining their prospects for economic growth. It's very easy for European states, it's very easy for North American states and activists to sit there and say, we should reduce the pace of economic growth. When you're a first world country, that the equation looks very different from whether you're a third world country and have aspirations to improve the economic conditions and livelihood of your populations at large. And I think that's the big issue. On the one hand, it's that issue of who manages and who can benefit from the carbon budget that remains. And on the other hand, it's who is going to compensate the developing world for efforts to move ahead with energy transitions and for living the consequences of the damage that has been done to climate already through increasing levels of carbon in the atmosphere. And whether the developed world feels that it essentially has a debt to pay. And I think that debt to pay, it's a very crass way of putting it, but I think that debt to pay is where it comes down. For the developing world, it's going to be about ensuring access to energy, ensuring that their economic growth isn't undermined, and fundamentally getting support for the industrialized world, which is responsible thus far for using up most of the carbon budget, getting support from the industrialized world, financial and otherwise, for addressing the costs of climate events and the cost of the impact that increasing levels of carbon in the atmosphere have had on climate globally.
And given that different regions have these different priorities, especially the global north versus the global south, is there a particular region around the globe that you would consider to be truly advancing in this energy transition when it comes to balancing current energy needs while at the same time beginning to institute a cleaner energy mix?
I think Europe stands by simply as a result of the energy security priorities that the war in Ukraine has brought up. Europe stands ahead of the rest of the pack. It already had an ambitious energy transitions policy in Fit for 55. There was government commitment. There was money being put in place. And I think, those factors will continue to drive European energy transitions and the pace. And in many ways, they will be the laboratory for what is and isn't possible. You have political determination, you have energy security prioritization, you have government money, and you have public support. Those four factors are going to be crucial in terms of driving Europe's energy transition policy. But elsewhere you are continuing to see sort of emphasis. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States has added important elements to the energy transition debate. It's added financial incentives for both this decarbonizing hydrocarbons, but also the development of alternative energy and the development of renewables. And similarly, China, for all of the efforts China has made this year to increase the use of coal, to replace very expensive gas, China remains the biggest spender on renewables on the planet. And clearly that's part of the political agenda moving forward for President Xi over the next 5 years and beyond. So again, you are still seeing that momentum. Energy security, the energy security concern is going to create blips and, is going to create sort of the redirection of funds in the short term. But beyond that, energy transitions and the transition away from fossil fuels is seen as delivering social, economic, and crucially political benefit. And as governments put money into it and create the policy environments that give investors greater certainty, and as the financial sector prioritizes this and makes the issue of greening their own investments a priority, what you are going to see is a confluence of events that sort of will eventually accelerate this. The question is over what period of time, and whether that's going to be fast enough given some of the more dire forecasts for climate moving forward.
So certainly blips in the short-term landscape, but ultimately different regions all heading in the same direction. Final question for today. What's your outlook on peak oil demand? Do you see it happening by 2030?
If I had the answer to that, I would be a very rich man living on my own private island. I don't necessarily. I think some of the issues in terms of peak demand have been overstated. I think the war in Ukraine is going to have one of those longer term effects where it is going to refocus on the issue of the use of hydrocarbons, oil included, as we move forward. Now, obviously, we have accelerated EV penetration. You're seeing changes in the transport sector that are going to have an impact. But I think that demand for oil is going to slow. But whether it peaks by 2030, I think is another matter altogether. I also think that how oil and gas companies actually respond in the short term is going to matter in terms of that question. So while not giving you a straight answer, certainly pointing out the factors. I think one is what the cost of capital is going to be, and whether the financial sector is going to increase the cost of capital for oil projects moving forward. I think the other thing is the pace at which oil and gas companies adapt. So you have, as I say, this effort on the part of some to decarbonize hydrocarbons. Those investments will probably extend the life of oil just simply because it will become cleaner. But I also think it goes back to your question about capital investment in the industry more generally. If the industry doesn't invest and demand for oil keeps rising, or even stays at its present level, the price of oil is going to go up, and that is going to start to price oil out of the market. And what you're going to get is inevitable demand destruction and an acceleration of renewables. So in some senses, what oil and gas companies do will matter for their own futures. And absent investment, and if we continue to see the low levels of upstream investment that we're seeing right now, then by 2030, you could see peak oil having hit just simply because the price of oil is so high for so long.
Definitely peak oil, open question. Whoever knows the answer to that will have their own private island. That's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, Dr. Alkadiri, for joining us. We really appreciate your expertise and your time, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks very much, Ross. It's been a great pleasure.